Raven Bennett was angry. The cops had been harassing her, watching her, making it clear they didn't like the questions she was asking, the things she was digging into. That day, it boiled over, and the warning in their eyes was clear. But Raven wasn't the type to back down. That night, they came to her home. They broke down the door with weapons ready. Jade Bennett, her twin, a Marine trained to react, woke to chaos. She grabbed her weapon, thinking they were being robbed. But before she could even get a shot off, the officers opened fire. And when the smoke cleared, she saw Raven on the ground. The officers thought the story would end there, but this wasn't over. Jade doesn't believe in the system. She doesn't believe in justice. She believes in retribution, no mercy, no hesitation, no escape. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The street lights flickered dimly outside, their glow barely cutting through the heavy silence of the night. The hum of passing cars, the occasional siren in the distance, just background noise blending into the fabric of the city. Inside the small rented house, the air was thick with tension, not from anything tangible, but from the weight of unspoken truths, the kind that settled in the chest and refused to leave. Jade sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, her sharp gaze steady, her posture relaxed but always alert. Across from her, Raven paced, her movements restless, her expression tight with frustration. She had kicked off her shoes hours ago, her socks barely making a sound against the wooden floor as she moved back and forth, too wired to sit still. "Same thing, over and over," Raven muttered, arms folding across her chest. "You know, I keep telling myself I won't let them get to me, but it's impossible. They act like I don't even belong here, like I'm not supposed to walk down the street without their permission." Jade exhaled slowly, tracking her sister's movements with that same quiet patience she had carried through every mission, every deployment. She had learned long ago that Raven didn't just talk. She felt everything down to her bones. And if she was worked up like this, there was a reason. "What happened?" Jade finally asked, voice low and even. Raven stopped pacing just long enough to lean against the counter, drumming her fingers against the surface. "I was walking back from the store, minding my business, and these two cops, big guys, full tactical gear like they're in a war zone, decide to stop me. Said I looked suspicious. Suspicious how? Because I was walking too fast? Too slow? Wearing a hoodie? What does that even mean?" Jade's grip on the mug tightened, but she said nothing. "I told them I had places to be, tried to keep it simple, but they didn't like that. Started with the whole watch your attitude routine. One of them even rested his hand on his gun, like that was supposed to mean something." Jade didn't react outwardly, but something in her expression shifted, something colder settling behind her eyes. "What did you do?" Raven let out a dry, humorless laugh. "What could I do? I kept my hands where they could see them, kept my voice calm, and let them feel important. Eventually, they let me go. But not before reminding me that I should be careful, like they were doing me a favor." Jade leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter now. "Did you get their names?" "Of course I did," Raven said, rolling her eyes. "Briggs, Cole, and Tate. And you best believe I'm putting their behavior on record. I've got a whole article half finished on police overreach, and now I've got first-hand proof." Jade inhaled deeply, considering her words carefully. She had spent years in places where power wasn't just exercised. It was wielded, unchecked, unchallenged. She had seen what happened when people like those officers thought they were untouchable. "You should be careful," she said finally, the words softer than she intended. Raven scoffed, shaking her head. "You sound like Mom." Jade huffed a quiet laugh, but she didn't argue. Their mother had spent their whole lives reminding them to move carefully, to be smart about their battles, to understand the risks of standing too tall in a world that didn't want them to. "I mean it," Jade continued, her tone even. "You should watch your back." "I always do," Raven shot back, but her voice lacked its usual fire. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the conversation lingered between them, heavy but unspoken. Eventually Raven sighed, rubbing a hand over her face before pushing away from the counter. "I should get some sleep," she muttered, "but I'm not letting this go." "I know," Jade said, a faint trace of a smile on her lips. "You never do." Raven nodded, her movements slower now as she made her way toward her room. She squeezed Jade's shoulder lightly in passing, a small, familiar gesture that said more than words ever could. Jade lingered in the kitchen a moment longer, standing in the dim light, listening to the soft creak of the house settling. Something about the night felt different, heavier, though she couldn't explain why. Shaking it off, she switched off the light and headed to her room, exhaustion finally settling over her. The last thing she heard before drifting off was the soft murmur of Raven's voice through the thin walls, still talking to herself, still defiant even in the quiet. And then, deep in the dead of night, came the sound of splintering wood, the deafening crash of boots storming through the door, and the sharp, fractured screams that shattered everything. The house trembled under the force of the breach, the door slamming open with an explosive crack that sent splinters flying across the floor. Shadows poured into the space, heavy boots pounding against the wood, voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy of shouted orders and clipped demands. Jade's body reacted before her mind caught up, the sudden shock jolting her upright, breath sharp, adrenaline flooding her veins. Still caught in the haze of sleep, her hand shot toward the nightstand, fingers curling around the grip of her pistol. The weight of it was familiar, grounding, a cold certainty in the midst of confusion. Noise. Too much noise. The world hadn't settled into focus yet. She pushed off the bed, heart slamming against her ribs, moving toward the hallway as the shouts grew louder. The floor was cool beneath her bare feet, her vision adjusting to the dim glow of streetlights filtering through the window. Her mind hadn't placed the pieces together yet. Who? Why? How? But she knew one thing for certain. Someone had just forced their way into their home, and they weren't stopping. Jade stepped into the hallway, gun at the ready, breath tight, muscles tense, instincts screaming to assess, to take control of the situation. Then the light hit her, blinding, overwhelming. A wall of white seared through her vision, forcing her to recoil, momentarily disoriented. "Drop the weapon! Hands in the air!" The voice was deafening, authoritative, slamming into her like a physical blow. She couldn't see past the glare, only the vague outlines of movement, shadows shifting, weapons raised. Her mind was still catching up. Who were they? Why were they here? And then, wait! "She's not!" Raven's voice. Jade barely registered her sister's movement, didn't have time to see where she was coming from, only knew that the moment Raven stepped into the hall behind her, everything collapsed into chaos. The shouts turned into gunfire. Jade ducked on instinct, years of training kicking in, her body moving before thought. She threw herself sideways into the nearest room, feeling the rush of air as bullets tore past her, the deafening crack of gunfire ringing through the narrow hallway. She hit the floor hard, her shoulders slamming against wood, the pistol slipping from her grip. But Raven hadn't moved fast enough. A sharp gasp, the sound of a body hitting the floor. Jade twisted sharply, her pulse spiking with dread as she saw her sister collapse in the open hallway, her body crumpling under the force of the shot. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts, one hand weakly clutching at her side, dark crimson already staining her shirt. "No!" Jade pushed up, lunging forward. The officers were still shouting, their weapons still raised, but Jade barely heard them. She reached out, her hands finding Raven's arms, gripping tight as she pulled, dragging her sister toward the room, away from the line of fire. Raven gasped again, her breath uneven, but she was still alive. Jade hauled her into the room, kicking the door shut with force, her heartbeat pounding like a war drum in her ears. She barely had time to take in Raven's face, the shock in her wide, glassy eyes, the way her lips trembled like she wanted to speak, but couldn't. before her body went limp against Jade's arms. No, 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 no. Jade pressed down on the wound, ignoring the slick warmth of blood pooling beneath her palms, her training kicking in, forcing her focus into something controlled, something precise. "Stay with me," she ordered, voice sharp, controlled, but barely holding together at the edges. "You hear me, Raven? Keep your eyes open." Raven's eyelids fluttered, her breath shallow, lips parting slightly as she tried to form words. Jade leaned in, pressing down harder on the wound, trying to keep her sister grounded, trying to keep her here. "Jade," Raven whispered, her voice barely there, her fingers weakly clutching at Jade's wrist. "They shot me." Jade swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep calm, to stay steady. I know. But you're okay. You're okay. You just have to hold on." Raven's breathing hitched, her eyes flickering between pain and panic. I can't breathe right." "Yes, you can," Jade said firmly, shifting slightly to adjust her grip, to keep pressure steady. "You're still talking. You're still breathing. Focus on that." Raven winced, her body trembling slightly beneath Jade's hands. I don't want to die." "You're not going to," Jade said, her voice edged with something sharp, something desperate. "You hear me? I won't let you." Raven let out a weak, breathy laugh, but it cut off into a pained cough. Jade felt something inside her twist violently. "Just hold on," she whispered, pressing down harder, ignoring the sting of tears welling in her eyes, ignoring the voices shouting outside the door, ignoring everything but the faint, trembling rise and fall of her sister's chest beneath her hands. "Jade," Raven rasped again, her fingers weakly clutching at her wrist. This is who they are." Jade's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The pounding footsteps outside grew louder, the weight of boots closing in, the voices shouting commands, their presence a reminder of what was coming next. But for these few seconds, it was just the two of them. Jade didn't move, didn't loosen her grip, didn't let the cold seep into her bones. She just kept pressing down, willing her sister to keep breathing, waiting for the moment when the door would finally burst open, and the rest of the nightmare would begin. The pounding of boots outside the door grew louder, voices barking orders, the heavy shuffle of movement filling the air like the slow build of an approaching storm. The door rattled under the weight of their presence, but Jade barely registered it. Her hands remained firm against the wound, pressing down, her fingers slick with warmth, the deep red of it staining the floor beneath them. Raven's breathing was shallow, unsteady, but she was still here, still holding on. "Just breathe," Jade whispered, more command than comfort, her own voice tight, forced, unwilling to let the cracks show. In and out. "Stay with me." Raven's lips parted, a shuddering breath escaping her, but she nodded weakly, her eyes fluttering as she fought to keep them open. Jade could see the fear in them, the quiet desperation of someone who knew they were slipping but refused to accept it. The door slammed against the frame again, hard enough to shake the walls. Jade ignored it. Then came the hiss, a sharp, pressurized burst, followed by the sudden, searing burn in the air. Jade's throat tightened instantly, her eyes stinging as the room filled with thick, acrid smoke. The realization hit too late. Tear gas. Her lungs clenched against the chemical burn, her body reacting on instinct, muscles seizing as she fought the urge to cough, to breathe too deeply, to let the gas settle into her chest. But then, a choked, gasping sound from beneath her. Raven. Panic shot through Jade's veins like fire. She looked down, eyes burning, vision blurred, but she could still see the way Raven's body convulsed beneath her. The weak, desperate struggle to inhale. Jade shifted, trying to shield her sister, trying to move them both away from the worst of it. But it was everywhere, filling every inch of the room, the poison latching onto their lungs, suffocating, relentless. Raven's breathing turned frantic, erratic, a series of sharp, broken gasps, that barely sounded like breaths at all. Her hands weakly grasped at Jade's wrist, fingers trembling, body shuddering with the effort to pull in air that refused to come. Jade tightened her grip, pressing her forehead against her sister's, her own throat closing, her own breath faltering, but none of it mattered. "Hold on," she rasped, barely able to force the words out, her voice ragged and raw. But Raven's grip loosened. Her body stilled. Jade froze, her breath caught in her chest, waiting, pleading for another rise, another faint, struggling inhale. It didn't come. The weight beneath her hands went slack. Jade's fingers trembled as she touched Raven's cheek, her own vision swimming, her own lungs screaming, but nothing else registered. Her sister wasn't breathing. She wasn't moving. Jade's hands hovered over the wound, pressing again, harder, as if she could force life back into her, as if the sheer will of it would be enough to keep her here. "Come back," she whispered, voice hoarse, fractured, nothing. "Come on, Raven. Breathe." Silence. A different kind of silence than before. One that didn't belong to the chaos outside. One that rang too hollow, too empty, too final. A fire ignited inside Jade's chest. Something raw, something consuming, something so blindingly violent she barely recognized it. It burned hotter than the tear gas in her lungs, hotter than the sting in her eyes, hotter than any rage she had ever known. They did this. They took her. The door burst open, but Jade didn't move. The shadows poured in, flashlights cutting through the haze, red laser sights painting over her skin. But she didn't flinch, didn't react to the orders being shouted at her. "On the ground! Hands where we can see them!" The words meant nothing. They surrounded her, weapons trained on her from every angle. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She could hear them moving in, feel the air shift as they closed the space between them, but her gaze remained locked on Raven, on the way the light flickered across her still, unmoving face, on the lifeless weight of the body she had sworn to protect. "Now! Down on the ground!" Jade exhaled, slow and steady. Her fingers curled into fists. Then they rushed her. The impact was instant, a crushing force slamming her down, bodies piling on top of hers, knees pressing against her back, hands wrenching her arms behind her. She didn't fight. Not yet. She let them force her down. Let them slam her face against the floor. Let the weight of them crush against her spine, as the metal of the cuffs bit into her wrists. But the rage didn't leave. It settled deep, an unshakable thing, something that wouldn't burn out, something that wouldn't end here. As they yanked her up, as they shoved her forward, dragging her from the room, she let her head tilt slightly. One last look at Raven's motionless form, a promise. The next time she walked free, she wouldn't be fighting to survive. She would be hunting, and every single one of them would pay. The low murmur of voices filled the air, steady and detached, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted just moments before. The flashing red and blue lights outside cast an eerie glow through the windows, flickering against the walls, coloring the world in alternating shades of warning and indifference. The house, once filled with life, now felt hollow. A crime scene draped in artificial light, its silence stretched thin beneath the weight of what had just transpired. Jade sat in the back of a police cruiser, wrists bound behind her, the sharp bite of the cuffs digging into her skin with every slight movement. She was still catching her breath, her lungs raw from the tear gas, her throat burned, every inhale a struggle, but she barely noticed. Her mind was fixed on one thing. Raven was gone. She had watched it happen, had felt the last shuddering breath against her fingers, had seen the moment her sister's body slackened, the light leaving her eyes, the warmth fading from her skin. And now, the ones responsible moved freely, their voices steady, their steps unhurried, as if none of it mattered, as if it were just another night, another routine operation, another incident they would write off and move past, like it meant nothing at all. She forced herself to listen. Outside the car, just beyond the open door, 3 officers stood talking, their conversation casual, the weight of what they had done barely touching them. "Briggs wants the reports done before morning," one of them muttered, his voice rough, irritated, like this was more of an inconvenience than a tragedy. "Said it needs to be airtight." Briggs. Jade's gaze locked onto the man speaking, her breath slowing as she memorized his face, his stance, the way he carried himself. "Should have been airtight before it even started." Another officer responded, shaking his head. "We were just supposed to rough her up a little, scare her." "Not—" He stopped short, his voice lowering slightly, as if suddenly aware that speaking too freely could be a mistake. Jade's fingers curled into fists behind her back. Not kill her. They hadn't meant to, but they had. And now they were more concerned with cleaning up their mess than with what they had taken from her. A third officer, taller than the others, his posture stiff, arms crossed, let out a slow breath. "It got out of hand," he said, his voice calmer, but no less complicit. "But it is what it is. She was in the way. And the other one," he flicked his gaze toward the cruiser where Jade sat, locked in place, watching him with an unwavering stare. "She's lucky she didn't pull that trigger." She had never known fury like this. She had felt rage before, in war, in battle, in the moments between orders and action. But this was different. This wasn't the sharp, immediate anger that came and went with the heat of combat. This was something deeper, something colder, something she could feel settling into her bones, wrapping around her like iron, forging itself into something unshakable. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was hoarse but steady. "Why?" The word cut through the space between them, quiet but heavy, weighted with everything she couldn't say, everything that had been stolen from her in a single moment of violence and indifference. The officers turned, their expressions unreadable, their postures shifting slightly, as if acknowledging her for the first time. Jade lifted her chin, eyes locked onto them, refusing to look away, refusing to break beneath the suffocating pressure of their presence. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice stronger now, her breath measured, controlled. "Why did you come into our home? Why did you kill her?" A long pause. The first officer, the one who had spoken about making the reports airtight, scoffed under his breath, shaking his head slightly before muttering, "Wrong place, wrong time." Jade's stomach twisted. The second officer, Cole, she caught his name when one of the others addressed him, gave her a glance that barely concealed his irritation, like this was beneath him, like her pain was a nuisance he didn't want to deal with. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, dismissive, the tone of someone who had justified this to himself long before stepping through her door. "It was a mistake. We had reason to be there. Things happened. That's all you need to know." "Things happened," Jade repeated, her voice dangerously even, the words rolling over her tongue like something foreign, something unreal. The taller officer, the one who had acknowledged that Raven had been in the way, shifted slightly, watching her now with a look she couldn't quite place. His name was Tate. She memorized that, too. She wondered if he could feel it, the way her rage curled around the air between them, the way it turned something as simple as silence into something suffocating. "She didn't have to die," she said. And it wasn't a question, wasn't an accusation, just a simple truth laid bare in the space between them. None of them answered. Jade's jaw tightened, her pulse steady now, the initial wave of grief and shock hardening into something she could use, something she could hold on to. She would remember their names. Briggs, Cole, Tate. She would remember their faces, the way they stood there now, impassive, indifferent, cleaning up their mess like it was just another day's work. She would remember everything, and when the time came, they would know exactly why. The holding cell was cold, not just in temperature, but in the way the air sat heavy and stagnant, pressing down like the walls themselves were closing in. The gray cinder block walls bore the marks of countless others who had sat in this same space, trapped beneath the weight of a system that had already decided their fate before they had even spoken. The dim overhead light flickered slightly, casting shadows along the hard floor, the thin metal bench beneath Jade offering little comfort as she sat motionless, wrists still aching from the too tight grip of the handcuffs that had only just been removed. Her breath was slow, measured, her body still except for the faint twitch of her fingers against her knee, the only sign that the rage inside her was still alive, still burning, still consuming. She had barely spoken since they threw her in here, the officers giving her nothing beyond routine procedure, no acknowledgement, no explanations. They didn't need to. She already knew what this was. They were waiting for her to break, for her to beg, for her to lash out so they could justify what they had done. She gave them none of it. She sat in silence, eyes forward, jaw tight, letting the weight of everything settle, letting it press into her bones, letting it carve itself into something unmovable. And then, through the thick fog of exhaustion, through the ache in her muscles, through the unbearable, suffocating emptiness in her chest, the memory surfaced. Raven. Earlier that day, she had been pacing in their kitchen, voice sharp with frustration, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her mind running too fast, too full, too restless. Jade had listened, had let her talk, had let her vent about the encounter, about the way they had stopped her for nothing, about the way they had looked at her like she didn't belong, about the way they had put their hands on their weapons as if she had done something wrong simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Briggs, Cole, Tate, the same names, the same men. Her breath hitched, fingers curling into her palms, nails pressing into skin, her heartbeat steady but thrumming just beneath the surface, every beat pushing her further into the realization that none of this had been an accident. They had been watching her sister. They had been waiting. And when the opportunity came, they had taken it. Not because they had to. Not because there had been any real threat, but because they could. The air in the holding cell felt heavier now, the silence no longer empty, but filled with something sharp, something twisting, something final. She had spent years learning how to survive war, learning how to anticipate the enemy, how to read movements before they happened, how to calculate her next steps before they even became necessary. She had never expected to have to use that training here, not against the people who were supposed to protect, not against the ones who had taken an oath to serve, but the reality sat in front of her now, clear, unshakable. No one was coming to fix this. No one was going to make it right. They would walk free, untouched, unchallenged, their lives continuing without consequence, while Raven was gone. Her laughter, her fire, her breath stolen, erased, another name on a list that no one would fight to remember, unless Jade did something about it. Her eyes lifted slowly, gaze settling on the heavy steel bars in front of her, but she wasn't really looking at them. She was looking past them, through them. Jade sat motionless, hands resting loosely in her lap, her wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs they had only just removed. Hours had passed, though she had lost track of exactly how many. No one had come to tell her anything. No explanations, no updates, just silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside the door. She had spent that time replaying everything. The moment the door had crashed open, the light blinding her, the deafening roar of gunfire, the sickening gasp that had left Raven's lips, the way her body had folded beneath the weight of the bullet, the desperate rise and fall of her chest as she had fought for breath, the way her fingers had clutched at Jade's arm, weak and trembling, before going still, and then the tear gas, the last thing that had stolen any chance of saving her. Jade inhaled slowly, controlling the rise and fall of her own breath, pressing it down, locking it away for later. The door creaked open. She didn't move, didn't lift her gaze right away, listening first, taking in the sound of measured footsteps against concrete. Then a voice. "Miss Bennet." She looked up. The man who had entered was tall, lean, dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit that had seen better days. His face was lined with the exhaustion of someone who had spent years fighting battles in courtrooms, his dark eyes sharp and unreadable as he regarded her from across the room. "Thomas Grayson," he introduced himself, stepping closer, his voice even, professional. "I'm your lawyer." Jade said nothing, just held his gaze. Waiting, he sighed, pulling out a chair from the metal table bolted to the floor and sitting down across from her. He set down a folder, the pages inside slightly crumpled, as if they had been handled too many times in too short a period. "I've spoken with the department," he said, flipping open the file, scanning the contents before looking back up. "They're holding you under suspicion of aggravated assault on law enforcement, possibly obstruction." Jade's fingers curled slightly against her knee. "Obstruction," she repeated, her voice dangerously even. Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. "That's what they're trying to make it sound like. You were armed. They entered under a no-knock warrant. You failed to comply with verbal orders." He glanced at her, his gaze assessing. "They're claiming that's what led to the incident." Jade didn't flinch. "The incident?" she echoed. Grayson studied her for a long moment before closing the file with a quiet snap. "They're already covering their tracks," he said, his voice lower now, quieter. "The reports are being finalized. Statements are being aligned. They'll say the operation was justified, that they had no choice." Jade's breath was steady, slow, her pulse no longer spiking at words she had already prepared herself to hear. "They shot my sister," she said, voice calm, controlled. "I never fired my weapon. I never even had a chance." "I know," Grayson said, his expression unreadable. "But proving that in a way that forces accountability? That's an entirely different battle." Jade tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing. "So, what you're saying is that there won't be justice?" Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his jaw before leaning forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. "Miss Bennet," he said, his tone shifting, careful but firm. "You served overseas. I'm sure you've seen how these things play out." Jade remained still. "They'll stall," he continued. "They'll bury evidence, discredit witnesses. They'll take your service record, your combat training, your firearm, and they'll twist the narrative. They'll say the officers were responding to an imminent threat, that they had no way of knowing who you were, that you were armed and trained to kill, that your presence alone justified their actions." He exhaled. "It won't matter that you didn't fire a shot. The argument will be that you could have." Jade's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible reaction she allowed herself. "Are you telling me not to fight this?" she asked, voice measured. "I'm telling you that the fight you're thinking of won't go the way you want it to," Grayson said bluntly. "You could go after them legally, sue the city, sue the department, but they'll bury you in motions and delays, drag it out for years, and in the end, maybe a settlement, maybe an internal review, maybe a few officers on administrative leave before being quietly reinstated elsewhere." He shook his head. "No real accountability. No real justice." Jade sat back slightly, her gaze steady. "And you?" Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Me? Do you believe I should fight?" A pause. Then Grayson sighed, leaning back. "I believe you deserve justice," he said carefully. "I just don't believe the system is built to give it to you." Jade let the words settle, let them root themselves in the place inside her that had already known the truth before he had spoken it. She had spent years learning how to fight battles that could be won. She had learned how to pick apart tactics, how to read the field, how to know when an enemy was stronger, when the terrain was against her, when a victory wasn't possible through conventional means. And this was a war she would never win if she fought it on their terms. Grayson watched her for a moment longer before reaching for the folder again. "The good news," he said, shifting the topic, "is that they don't have enough to hold you. No formal charges have been filed. I've spoken to the DA's office, and since there's no evidence you fired or resisted, they're cutting you loose." Jade nodded once. "When?" Grayson closed the file and stood. "Now." He knocked once on the metal door, signaling to the officer outside. A moment later, the lock clicked, the door swinging open. A uniformed officer stepped in, her expression neutral, but there was something unreadable in her eyes as she stepped back, motioning for Jade to follow. Jade stood, stretching her wrists slightly as she did, rolling her shoulders, shaking off the stiffness of hours spent waiting. Grayson gave her one last look, something almost unreadable in his gaze, but he didn't say anything more. Jade didn't either, because she already knew what needed to be done. And it wouldn't happen in a courtroom. Jade stepped out of the holding cell, her posture steady, her expression unreadable, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The hallway stretched out before her in dull, lifeless grays, the same as every police station she had ever seen, the same as every place designed not to serve but to contain, to control. The air smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, the kind of scent that clung to everything, that lived in the cracks of tile floors and the fabric of worn-out uniforms. She walked forward, flanked by an officer on one side and Grayson on the other, neither of them speaking, neither acknowledging the weight pressing down on the air between them. The station was still alive with activity. Officers moving in and out of rooms, shuffling paperwork, answering calls. But for Jade, the world had narrowed, her vision focused, every detail filtering in through the sharp edge of her fury. Then she saw them. Briggs, Cole, Tate, standing near the front desk, laughing. Briggs leaned against the counter, gesturing casually, his voice carrying easily over the low hum of conversation. Cole smirked at something he said, shaking his head, the casual ease of a man who had never once feared consequences. Tate took a sip from his coffee, his posture loose, comfortable, unconcerned. They weren't worried. They weren't grieving. They weren't haunted by the image of a woman bleeding out on the floor, gasping for air while the poison they had thrown into the room stole what little life she had left. Raven was gone, and they had moved on without a second thought. Jade's hands curled into fists, the sharp edge of her nails pressing into her palms, grounding her, keeping her from acting on the raw, immediate impulse that surged through her like a tidal wave. She wanted to lunge, to rip the smugness from their faces, to press them against the same cold floor where Raven had died, and make them understand, make them feel it, make them choke on the reality of what they had done. But not yet, not here, not like this. Revenge wasn't a blunt instrument. It wasn't an explosion of rage that burned bright and fast, leaving nothing but ashes behind. It was slow. It was calculated. It was patient. She forced herself to breathe, to slow the pounding of her heart, to push past the suffocating heat rising in her chest. She kept walking, past Briggs, past Cole, past Tate, past the men who had stolen everything from her and felt nothing. And as she did, they didn't even notice her. She was nothing to them, an afterthought, an inconvenience dealt with and discarded. That was their mistake. The doors slid open, and she stepped out into the night, the cool air wrapping around her, the distant sounds of the city filling the space where her rage had made everything else silent. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for just a second, letting the moment settle. Then she opened them. She had work to do. They had laughed their last laugh, and she would make sure they never saw it coming. The city stretched out before her, restless and unknowing, the glow of streetlights reflecting off damp pavement, the distant hum of traffic a steady pulse beneath the surface of the night. Jade moved through it like a shadow, unseen, unnoticed, her mind already working through the steps that would bring her closer to what she needed. Answers, leverage, justice, retribution. She had spent years learning how to track an enemy, how to break them down, how to pick them apart piece by piece before delivering the final blow. But war had rules, lines drawn in the sand, a clear distinction between those who wore a uniform and those who did not. This was different. There were no battlefields here, no official orders, no chain of command, just her and them, and she would not strike blind. She needed information, not just about their routines, their vulnerabilities, but about why. Why they had chosen Raven, why they had singled her out, why they had decided she was a lesson that needed to be taught. And for that, she needed the weakest link, Cole. He was the youngest of the three, the least experienced, the one who had hesitated when speaking outside the station, the one who had shifted uncomfortably when Briggs had brushed off Raven's death like it was nothing. It wasn't guilt. None of them felt that. But hesitation was enough. Hesitation meant cracks. And cracks could be broken wide open. She had started that same night, moving with the kind of patience most people didn't possess, watching from a distance, noting his habits, the places he went when he thought no one was looking, the people he spoke to, the ones he ignored. He lived alone in a small apartment complex on the east side of the city, a building that had seen better days, its exterior worn by time and neglect. No family, no close connections, just the occasional bar visit, where he drank just enough to loosen his guard, but never enough to lose control. He took the same route home every night, never varying his routine, never once considering that someone might be watching, might be waiting. That was his second mistake. His first had been thinking he would walk away from what he had done. Jade followed him for days, slipping into his world without ever making her presence known, studying his movements, his patterns, the way he carried himself when he thought he was safe. He was arrogant, but not careful. The kind of man who had always had the system behind him, who had never been taught to fear the consequences of his actions. But that would change. She needed to know what he knew, needed to hear it from his own mouth, needed to pull it from him piece by piece until the full truth lay bare in front of her. Because once she had that truth, she wouldn't just make them pay. She would make them understand exactly why they were dying. The night was thick with humidity, the weight of it settling over the city like a damp, suffocating veil. Streetlights flickered against wet pavement, the distant hum of traffic a steady undercurrent beneath the quiet pulse of the late hour. It was the kind of night that swallowed sound, that blurred the edges of movement, that made people keep their heads down, too caught up in their own lives to notice the small shifts in the world around them. Perfect. Jade had been watching for days, her patience unshaken, her focus unbreakable, waiting for the right moment. And tonight, that moment had come. Friday night. Routine. Cole spent his evenings the same way, never once considering that his predictable nature might be a weakness, that his habits might one day be used against him. He drank at a bar 3 blocks from his apartment. Always the same one. Always for just over an hour. Always just enough alcohol to take the edge off, but never enough to dull his awareness entirely. He thought it made him sharp. He thought it made him smart. But Jade knew the truth. Men like him had never been taught to fear the consequences of their actions. But she was going to change that. She waited in the shadows across the street, her breath slow, controlled, her muscles loose but ready. She had chosen her position carefully. A space just outside the glow of the streetlights, a blind spot in the cameras, far enough from the bar's entrance to avoid unwanted attention, but close enough to move quickly when the time came. Cole emerged just after 11, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable as he adjusted his jacket, nodding absently to the bartender on his way out. He didn't look over his shoulder, didn't check his surroundings. He had no reason to. He wasn't the one who had something to fear. Not yet. Jade fell into step behind him, her movements seamless, her footfalls silent against the pavement, keeping just enough distance to remain unnoticed. She had already mapped out his route, already memorized the turns, the alleys, the blind spots, where the streetlights flickered just a little too dimly. He was walking straight into her hands. It wasn't until he was halfway home that he noticed something was off. She saw the moment it clicked, his shoulders tensing slightly, his pace shifting just a fraction, the way his head tilted ever so slightly, as if listening for something beyond the usual hum of the city. He glanced back. just a quick, casual look. But she had already moved, slipping into the deeper shadows of a narrow side street, out of sight before his gaze could land on her. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly, dismissing the unease. Mistake. She closed the distance. It happened fast, faster than he had time to process. One moment he was walking, the next he was being yanked backward into the alley, his balance thrown off, his body slamming against the damp brick wall with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. His reaction was instinctive, muscles tensing, arms coming up to shove her off. But she was faster. Her forearm pressed hard against his throat, cutting off his first attempt at a shout, her body pinning his against the wall, the sharp edge of her knee pressing into his ribs to keep him from getting his footing. His eyes widened, breath hitching as recognition flickered through the haze of adrenaline. Bennett? His voice was tight, strained against the pressure at his throat. She didn't respond. His hands grasped at her arms, fingers digging in, trying to push her off. But she was stronger, her grip unrelenting, her focus absolute. He started to shift his weight, trying to use his height to his advantage, to regain control of the situation. But she anticipated it before he had even fully committed to the move. Her knee drove up hard into his gut, knocking the wind from him completely. As he doubled over, gasping, she twisted sharply, shifting her weight just enough to send him careening sideways into the wall again, his skull connecting with a dull crack. His body sagged slightly, dazed, but not unconscious. Good. She needed him awake. His breath was ragged now, his body struggling against the shock, against the sudden turn of events he hadn't been prepared for. His hands grasped weakly at her jacket, a last-ditch effort to regain some control. But she was already moving, already securing him, already ensuring that he wasn't going anywhere. It took less than 20 seconds. The zip ties slid over his wrists in a swift, practiced motion, locking his arms behind his back before he could even register what was happening. The strip of cloth she had brought with her pressed against his mouth, muffling the protests that finally started to form. His words lost to the night as she secured the knot tightly behind his head. She glanced around once, checking for movement, for witnesses. But the street was still empty. She had chosen well. With one final, swift motion, she lifted him just enough to get him moving, half dragging, half guiding him toward the waiting vehicle she had positioned just outside the alley. The back doors already open. He struggled, still dazed but fighting, his body resisting even as his mind worked to catch up. She let him feel like he had a chance, let him waste his energy, because soon there would be no fight left in him at all. She shoved him into the back of the van, his body hitting the floor with a heavy thud, his muffled protests now full, panicked, but useless. The doors slammed shut, sealing them inside the darkness. She climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine, her pulse steady, her breath even. She pulled away from the curb, the city slipping past her, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows against the glass. There was an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, long abandoned, forgotten by the world. The perfect place for what came next. She had her first target, and by the time the sun rose, she would have her first confession. The warehouse was silent, except for the steady drip of water from a rusted pipe overhead, the slow, rhythmic sound echoing in the vast emptiness of the abandoned space. The air was thick with dust, the scent of old oil and decay lingering in the corners where the light from the flickering overhead bulb didn't quite reach. Jade stood motionless, arms crossed, gaze locked onto the man slumped in the chair before her. Cole's breathing was ragged, his wrists raw from where he had strained against the zip ties binding them behind his back. His head hung forward, his body tense, shoulders rising and falling with every shallow inhale. His face was slick with sweat, his pulse hammering so hard she could see it in his throat. He was afraid. Good. She had taken her time. Let him sit in the dark. Let him feel the weight of his situation. Let him listen to his own breathing. his own thoughts, the slow realization that no one was coming for him. The fear had settled deep in him long before she had even spoken a word. Now, it was time. She stepped forward, slow, deliberate, her boots scuffing against the concrete just enough to let him know she was moving. His head snapped up, eyes wild, darting around the dimly lit space before finally landing on her. He swallowed hard, his breath hitching as he struggled to straighten himself, to regain some semblance of control. She said nothing, just waited. The silence stretched between them, thick, heavy, pressing down like a weight neither of them acknowledged, but both understood. Finally, he broke. "What do you want?" His voice was hoarse, raw from whatever screaming he had done earlier when she'd first secured him. Jade tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You already know the answer to that." His jaw clenched. "I don't—" Before he could finish, she moved. Not a punch, not a slap, just a sharp, precise strike to his leg, just above the knee. A practiced maneuver that sent a jolt of pain through his body without causing permanent damage. His gasp was sharp, his body jerking against the restraints, a ragged curse spilling from his lips before he bit it back. "I don't have time for lies," she said, her voice calm, steady, controlled. "We both know why you're here. So, let's not waste either of our time pretending you don't." His breathing was uneven now, his body tense, muscles coiled beneath the weight of fear and pain. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained to withstand this. He was trained to hold power, not to be stripped of it. He wasn't built for this kind of pressure, and she was. He wet his lips, eyes darting to the side before settling back on her. "It wasn't my call." Jade remained still. "Whose was it?" Cole hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find the right words, the right way to spin this in his favor. Another strike, this time to his ribs. Controlled, precise. Just enough to knock the wind out of him, to remind him that stalling wouldn't save him. He gasped, chest heaving, his body writhing against the restraints as he struggled for breath. "Briggs!" he choked out. "And Tate! It was them!" Jade didn't react, didn't give him anything, just waited. Cole swallowed hard, his head hanging forward, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. They had history with her. He coughed slightly, shifting in the chair, wincing at the strain in his arms. She had been digging into them for months, looking into old cases, asking questions, talking to people she shouldn't have been talking to. Jade felt her pulse slow, her grip on control tightening even as something dark twisted in her gut. She had known Raven was bold, had known she never let things go when she smelled corruption, but she hadn't known how deep she had been in. What kind of history? Cole licked his lips again, his face pale, his body sagging slightly, as if the weight of the truth was crushing him as much as the situation he was in. Briggs and Tate? There were incidents, complaints, cover-ups. They've been doing this for years, not just to Raven, to other people. Jade's breath was slow, steady, her mind already processing, already cataloging every word. "She found something," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. Cole nodded weakly. She was getting close, too close. They knew she wouldn't stop, so they decided to handle it. Her jaw tightened, her muscles coiling with the effort to keep herself from reacting. "So they orchestrated the raid," she said, her voice calm, detached, the only sign of the fire burning beneath her words in the sharpness of her tone. Cole nodded again, his body trembling slightly. "They knew she'd be home. They knew they could make it look justified. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't part of the planning. He exhaled shakily. "I just followed orders." Jade let the silence stretch again, her eyes never leaving him. Followed orders. Just like that. He thought it absolved him. As if standing by while innocent people were murdered was anything less than complicity. As if not pulling the trigger himself made him any less guilty. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to breathe, forced herself to focus on what mattered. She had what she needed. She knew who had made the call. And now, they would pay for it. Slowly, she stepped back, the faint scuff of her boots against the concrete, the only sound in the heavy silence of the room. Cole's eyes followed her, his body tense, his breath shallow, waiting for her next move. She tilted her head slightly, considering him, letting the moment settle. Then, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, unmarked burner phone, and tossed it onto the floor near his feet. He flinched slightly, eyes flicking between her and the phone. "You're going to call them," she said, her voice quiet, controlled. "You're going to set a meeting, somewhere private, somewhere isolated." Cole's face drained of what little color remained. "No," he breathed. "They'll know something's wrong. They'll—" Jade leaned down, just close enough that he could see the look in her eyes. "That's not a request." The fear in his face deepened, his breath shuddering slightly as he looked away, swallowing hard. He knew he had no choice. Jade straightened, exhaling slowly, already planning the next step, already seeing the end before the game had even begun. Briggs and Tate thought they had won. They thought they had buried the past, silenced the one person who could take them down, but they hadn't. Raven had left behind more than just a story. She had left behind a soldier. And now, that soldier was coming for them. The air inside the warehouse hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp concrete and rusted metal, the silence stretching long between them. The dim overhead bulb flickered slightly, its glow casting uneven shadows across the floor, highlighting the rigid set of Cole's shoulders, the way his breath came in short, panicked bursts. He was trying to hold it together, trying to mask the fear bleeding through his expression, but Jade had seen enough men break to know when the fight had already left them. She stood motionless, watching him, letting the weight of what had just happened settle in his mind. She had everything she needed. She knew the truth now, knew that Briggs and Tate had orchestrated Raven's murder, knew that Cole had been nothing more than a willing bystander, a man who followed orders without question, too weak to stand on his own, and now he would pay the price. Jade exhaled slowly, stepping forward, watching as Cole tensed, his pulse visible at his throat, his fingers twitching against the restraints. He was waiting for the inevitable, waiting for the final strike, waiting for the blade or the bullet that would end this. But she had other plans. She leaned down slightly, just enough to meet his wide, frantic eyes, her voice calm, steady, unwavering. "I'm not going to kill you." Cole's breath hitched, his gaze flickering with something that almost looked like hope, like he had misjudged her, like maybe, somehow, he would get out of this alive. She let him have that hope for a second, just long enough for it to settle, before she stepped back, crossing her arms loosely over her chest. "Someone will find you here," she said, voice measured. Eventually, Cole swallowed hard, his shoulders shaking slightly. What does that mean?" Jade didn't answer. She simply turned, moving toward the warehouse exit with slow, deliberate steps, her boots scuffing slightly against the concrete, each sound sharp, echoing in the vast emptiness of the space. Behind her, Cole's breathing grew more erratic. "Wait," she kept walking. "Wait, you can't just leave me here." She reached the door, gripping the rusted handle, pulling it open just enough for the cold night air to slip through. "Jade, please." His voice cracked, raw with desperation now. "I told you what you wanted to know. You said you weren't going to kill me." She glanced back, just once, her expression unreadable. "I'm not." Then she stepped through the door. And that was when Cole lost it. The panic set in all at once, his breath ragged, wild, his body twisting violently against the restraints. The chair beneath him wobbled, its metal legs scraping against the floor, his struggles growing more erratic with every passing second. He thrashed harder, the back legs of the chair lifting slightly, tipping precariously as his muffled screams filled the warehouse, his voice fractured, disbelieving, full of terror he had never felt before. "Jade, don't do this! Don't—" The chair tipped too far. The crash echoed loud and final, his body hitting the concrete hard, the back of his skull connecting with the floor in a sickening, hollow crack. His body jerked once, his breath catching in his throat. Then, nothing. Jade stood outside the warehouse, listening. The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken. She let out a slow breath, closing her eyes for just a second, letting the moment settle, letting the reality of it sink in. She had given him a chance, and he had been the one to waste it. When she opened her eyes again, she was already moving, her steps steady, her body loose, controlled. The city lights flickered in the distance, their glow barely reaching the outskirts where the warehouse sat. Forgotten, abandoned, just like the man who had died inside it. One down, two to go, and they wouldn't see her coming. The night air was crisp, colder than it had been earlier, the weight of it settling over the empty streets in a way that made everything feel quieter, heavier. Jade moved through the city with the kind of ease that came from years of knowing how to disappear into the background. Her body loose, her pace controlled, every step measured, every movement purposeful. She hadn't stayed long at the warehouse. She had lingered just long enough to be sure, long enough to hear the way the silence stretched, thick and unmoving, long enough to know that Cole wouldn't be leaving that place. And now, as she walked, as the lights from passing cars flickered against her skin, as the distant hum of the city pulsed around her, she let herself wonder, had she done the right thing? She hadn't killed him. Not directly. Not with her own hands. Not in the way she had planned. She had left him breathing, left him with a chance, left him in a moment of panic that had been entirely his own doing. But was that enough? Was that absolution? Or had she simply found a way to let herself pretend she wasn't the executioner? Did it even matter? The question burned at the edges of her thoughts, but she pushed it down, burying it beneath the weight of everything else that still had to be done. Because the truth was simple. She had given him an opportunity, however slim, however cruel it might have seemed, and he had squandered it. He had panicked. He had thrashed and fought, his own fear sealing his fate, and she had just walked away. She let out a slow breath, exhaling through her nose, letting the cold settle into her lungs, letting the quiet stretch between her thoughts until it dulled, until it became nothing more than background noise. Because the next step had already been set in motion, and now there was no time left for questions. The shipping yard loomed ahead, the vast expanse of rusted metal containers stacked like silent sentinels, rows upon rows stretching out into the darkness. A perfect maze of cover, of places to disappear. The ground beneath her boots was uneven, gravel crunching softly as she moved, slipping between the shadows, her breath slow, her pulse steady. She had arrived before him. Good. She positioned herself carefully, choosing a vantage point just beyond the glow of the scattered floodlights. Waiting, watching, and then, finally, a car pulled in, the headlights cutting through the dark, the low rumble of the engine, the only sound in the emptiness of the yard. Briggs. The driver's side door creaked open, and he stepped out, his movements slow, casual. A man who had spent his entire life feeling untouchable. He exhaled, stretching his shoulders slightly, scanning the space around him with a careful but unconcerned glance. He wasn't expecting trouble. He thought he was meeting Cole. Jade stayed where she was, letting the silence stretch, letting him feel the empty space around him, letting him lean into the false comfort of the routine, the predictability of it. Then she moved, deliberate, unrushed, her steps light, her posture loose, the way she carried herself just familiar enough to make him believe, just for a moment, that Cole had actually shown up. Briggs let out an irritated sigh, shaking his head slightly as he turned, the dim glow of the overhead lights catching the sharp edges of his face. "About time," he muttered. "If this is about that black activist moron we killed, you could have just said so over the phone." Jade didn't stop walking. Briggs chuckled, a low, amused sound, shaking his head as if he found the entire thing ridiculous, as if Raven's death, as if her life, had meant nothing more than a moment of inconvenience, a memory that didn't even deserve weight. Then, finally, he looked up, and he saw her. The amusement in his face flickered, his smirk faltering just slightly, just enough for the moment to stretch between them, for the recognition to settle, for his mind to catch up to what was standing in front of him. His lips parted slightly, a slow exhale slipping past them. Then, as if on instinct, as if some deep, primal part of him knew what was about to happen, the smirk returned. He laughed. It was a slow, drawn-out sound, something edged with amusement, but layered beneath it was something else, something darker, something that said he had already decided how this would end. "Well, well," he said, his voice light, taunting. "I guess I should have expected this." Jade didn't respond. Briggs tilted his head slightly, studying her the way one might study an opponent sizing up a fight, looking for the weak spots, looking for the cracks. "You look just like her, you know," he continued, taking a slow step forward, his hands loose at his sides, relaxed. "Same fire in the eyes. Same little attitude, I bet. Probably a whole lot meaner, though." Another step. Jade let him come closer. Let him feel like he had control. Let him feel like he was the one dictating how this was going to play out. Raven had that problem too, he mused, shaking his head, as if it were all just a shame, as if she had been nothing more than a lesson that had needed to be taught. Never knew when to quit, always asking the wrong questions, always pushing, always thinking she was the smartest person in the room. You'd think people would learn, but Jade moved, fast. Before he could react, before he could reach for the weapon tucked at his waist, before he could shift into defense, she struck, a sharp, brutal kick to his knee, sending him staggering back with a curse, his balance thrown, his expression shifting from amusement to something darker, something more alert. He caught himself quickly, feet planting firm, his weight shifting, the trained movements of a man who had been in more than his fair share of fights, of confrontations, of struggles for dominance. But this wasn't a fight he had been prepared for. Jade didn't give him a second to recover. She was already moving, already closing the distance before he could fully straighten, before he could adjust. Her fist connected with his ribs, the impact solid, controlled, forcing the breath from his lungs in a sharp exhale. Briggs grunted, his body twisting with the hit, his movements quick, defensive. He swung, but she was faster, ducking low, stepping into him, grabbing the front of his jacket in one swift, precise movement, using his momentum against him. They hit the gravel hard, the impact sending dust into the air, the weight of their bodies shifting, struggling, his knee coming up, trying to force space between them. But Jade was already ahead of him, already adjusting, already securing her position, pressing down, keeping him trapped beneath her weight, her hands pressing against his throat just hard enough to keep him still. His breathing was uneven now, his eyes dark, sharp, still confident, still convinced he could get the upper hand. Jade leaned in slightly, just enough for him to feel the heat of her breath against his skin. "You killed my sister," she murmured, her voice quiet, sharp, edged with something colder than rage, something more dangerous than grief. Briggs smirked, lips curling slightly even as his breath came short, uneven. "Yeah," he rasped, amusement still flickering behind his expression. "And I'd do it again." Jade inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening just slightly, the pressure against his throat increasing, the moment stretching long and deliberate. Briggs twisted hard, shifting his weight, his body surging beneath her grip in a practiced, forceful movement. Before Jade could lock in the chokehold fully, he bucked against her, driving his elbow into her side just enough to force her back. The sudden shift in momentum sent them both rolling, the coarse gravel scraping against her palms as she adjusted, flipping herself up into a low, ready stance. Briggs coughed, rubbing his throat where her grip had nearly cut off his air. He pulled himself upright, shaking off the daze, rolling his shoulders as if loosening them before a fight. A slow, smug grin crept across his face, his breathing heavy but controlled, his stance wide, steady. "Not bad," he muttered, voice still hoarse, but laced with amusement. Guess all that military training wasn't just for show. Jade didn't respond. She stood across from him, feet planted, body poised, the raw tension between them stretching, thickening. The air carried the distant scent of metal and dust. The vast expanse of the shipping yard silent, except for the low hum of the city far beyond them. The moment was heavy, charged, a battlefield with only 2 combatants left standing. Briggs took a slow step to the side, and she mirrored him. They circled each other, watching, waiting, measuring. You know, he said, exhaling slowly, shaking his head slightly. I was hoping you'd do something stupid like this. Saves me the trouble of figuring out how to get rid of you the hard way. Jade's fingers twitched slightly, the only outward sign of the fury simmering beneath her controlled exterior. You already tried, she said, voice even, sharp. Didn't work. Briggs chuckled lowly, tilting his head, the flickering yard lights catching the sharp angles of his face. That wasn't personal, he said. Just business. Jade inhaled slowly, steady, her gaze locked onto his. And Raven? Briggs smirked. An ugly thing, dark and amused, his hands loose at his sides, relaxed, confident. She should have known when to quit. Jade's jaw tightened, the breath in her lungs sharp, cold, slicing through her ribs like something visceral, something unshakable. You hunted her down, she said, each word deliberate, edged with a quiet, lethal precision. You raided her home. You shot her. You left her to die on the floor, choking on her own blood. Briggs didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't deny it. He just let out a slow, amused breath, his smirk deepening. She was a problem, he said simply. She was asking too many questions, digging into things that didn't concern her. People like me? He gestured to himself, exhaling as if it were all just another conversation, just another day. We don't let problems fester. Jade's breath slowed, controlled, pressing down the tremor of rage curling in her stomach. She was trying to expose you, Briggs snorted. Yeah, and what good did that do her? His head tilted slightly, his smirk widening. The world doesn't care about people like her. She thought if she just made enough noise, someone would listen, someone would do something. But no one did they? He chuckled, shaking his head. No lawsuits, no protests, no consequences. The city moved on. Jade's pulse beat slow and deliberate, her breathing measured, every part of her forcing control over the wildfire beneath her skin. Briggs saw it. He saw the restraint, the unshaken, lethal focus in her stance, and it only seemed to amuse him more. You think this ends with me? He asked, his voice low, taunting. You think this is some big victory? That you're gonna do what? Kill me and suddenly the world gets better? Jade's eyes narrowed slightly. The first real flicker of movement since they had begun circling each other. Briggs's grin widened, mistaking it for hesitation, for doubt. You're out of your depth, soldier, he murmured, his voice smooth, slow, dripping with something cold and condescending. You don't matter. I don't matter. This is just how things work. You think I'm the only cop out there who handles things the way they need to be handled? You think I'm the worst of them? His smile sharpened. I'm just the one who got caught. Jade inhaled, slow, deep, letting the weight of his words settle, letting the moment stretch between them. Then she took a single step forward. Briggs tensed slightly. The shift almost imperceptible, but she saw it. His fingers curled just slightly, his weight shifting in preparation. He still thought he had the advantage. He still thought he was stronger. Jade's voice was quiet when she finally spoke. You're right, she said simply. This doesn't end with you. Briggs chuckled, shaking his head, amused at her admission. Then her fist connected with his ribs. Sharp, precise. The sound of the impact cracked through the air, his breath leaving his lungs in a sharp exhale. He staggered slightly, his grin faltering as he absorbed the hit, as the reality settled. Jade stepped forward again, fluid, controlled, striking again, his shoulder this time, a brutal force that sent his body twisting with the momentum. He gritted his teeth, his expression shifting from smug to something colder. something darker. He lunged, trying to grab hold of her, but she was already moving, already anticipating, already shifting away from the reach of his grasp. Briggs exhaled sharply, planting his feet, recalibrating, shaking off the first hits, eyes narrowing slightly as he finally began to take her seriously. "Okay," he muttered, rolling his neck, letting out a breath. "Let's see what you really got." Jade didn't respond. She didn't need to, because this wasn't a fight. It was an execution, and he was about to realize it. The air between them was charged, thick with the weight of inevitability. The slow, deliberate circling had ended. The moment of measured words, of taunts and admissions, was over. Now, there was only the fight. Briggs shifted his stance, his feet planting firm, his hands loosening at his sides, his posture shifting from amusement to something more dangerous. He had spent years using brute force to control situations. A man accustomed to winning simply because he was the biggest, the strongest, the one wearing the badge. He had never been in a fight like this before. Not with someone like her. Jade knew it. And she would make sure he did too. He moved first. A quick, aggressive lunge, his right hand flashing forward, aiming for control, trying to grab her, to force her into a hold, to drag the fight into his territory. But she was faster. She pivoted sharply, twisting just out of reach, her body coiling, her next move already calculated before his even landed. The opening was there. She struck. Her elbow connected with his ribs, sharp and precise, the force of it knocking him slightly off balance. Before he could recover, she shifted, her knee slamming upward, driving into his gut with unrelenting force. His body folded slightly, his breath leaving him in a short, choked sound. But he wasn't down yet. Briggs growled, recovering quicker than she anticipated, his arm snapping out, fingers managing to catch the fabric of her jacket. He yanked hard, trying to use his size against her, trying to pull her into his momentum. Jade let him. She twisted with it, stepping into the motion instead of fighting against it, using the force to her advantage. As his weight shifted forward, expecting resistance, she slammed her palm upward, driving it under his chin, snapping his head back with brutal efficiency. He stumbled, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. But this wasn't about distance. This wasn't a fight she would let drag out. This was an execution. And she had already chosen how it would end. Briggs staggered back, shaking his head slightly, his breathing heavier now, his expression shifting, realization settling behind his eyes. Jade didn't let him think for long. She surged forward, closing the gap again before he could fully reset. Her fist connected with his jaw, the sharp crack of the impact cutting through the empty yard. His body twisted with the blow, but he managed to stay on his feet, his balance still under him. He turned back to face her, spitting blood onto the gravel, his tongue running over his teeth, as if checking what was still intact. Then, slowly, he laughed. It was a low, breathless sound, something dark and amused, something layered with arrogance that hadn't quite faded yet. "You're good," he admitted, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, flexing his fingers slightly as if he could still change the outcome. "But I've had worse." Jade exhaled slowly, her pulse steady, her body loose, unshaken. "No," she murmured, "you haven't." Briggs grinned, shifting his weight, preparing to charge again, but she was already moving. She let him come forward, let him think for one last second that he was still in control, that he could still turn this around. But the second he stepped in, she dropped low, sweeping her leg out, her foot hooking around his ankle, taking his feet out from under him. He went down hard. The impact sent a sharp, guttural grunt from his throat. The breath knocked from his lungs as his back hit the uneven gravel. He tried to push up, tried to roll back to his feet, but Jade was already on him, already pressing forward, already shifting into the final move. Her knee drove into his chest, pinning him, her hands locking around his throat before he could react. His fingers clawed at her wrists, his body twisting, fighting, his muscles straining as he tried to throw her off. But she had the leverage, the position, the control. She pressed down. Briggs gasped, his breath turning ragged, his fingers curling, his body jerking beneath her weight. His eyes locked onto hers, something flashing behind them. Anger, disbelief, something more primal. The moment a predator realizes they are no longer the one in control. "You killed my sister," she whispered, voice calm, unwavering. His struggles weakened. "You laughed about it." His fingers twitched. "You thought you'd walk away." His body jerked once, his breath stuttering, his vision darkening, the fight leaving his limbs in slow, fading tremors. Jade's grip didn't loosen. She watched the life drain from his eyes, watched as the last flicker of arrogance, of cruelty, of certainty that he was untouchable, slipped away. Then, finally, he stopped moving. She exhaled slowly, holding her position for a moment longer, letting the weight of it settle, letting the reality of what she had done press down on her bones. Then she pushed off him, standing, stepping back, letting the silence stretch. 2 down, 1 to go. The night pressed in around her, thick with the weight of everything she had done, everything she had yet to do. The city moved as it always had, indifferent and unknowing, the distant hum of cars blending with the occasional wail of a siren, the neon lights casting fleeting glows against damp pavement. It was a city that swallowed the past, that let the worst of men slip between the cracks, that erased the names of the dead as if they had never mattered at all. But Raven's name would not be erased. Jade moved through the streets with careful precision, blending into the fabric of the city, her thoughts as sharp as her focus. 2 down, 1 left. Tate, the final piece. And yet, something inside her felt different now. She had told herself from the beginning that this was justice, that these men had made their choice, had sealed their fates long before she had even set her sights on them, that their deaths were not just necessary, but deserved. And yet, as she walked, as the echoes of the fight with Briggs still burned beneath her skin, a part of her hesitated, caught in the hollow space between what she had done and what it meant. Briggs had deserved to die. So had Cole, hadn't they? Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her breath steady, controlled, but her pulse thrummed with something she couldn't quite name. Briggs had laughed about killing Raven, had admitted it without a trace of remorse. Cole had justified his own cowardice with the excuse that it wasn't his choice. Neither of them had been innocent. Neither of them had shown regret. Neither of them would have ever faced justice in a courtroom. Not with the system as it was. Not with the way men like them were protected. So why was there a voice in the back of her mind whispering that this wasn't who she was? She exhaled slowly, pushing the thought down, locking it away. She couldn't afford doubt. Not now. Tate was still out there. And unlike the others, he wasn't waiting to be caught. She had seen the shift in him after Cole's body was found. He had stopped showing up at the precinct, had gone dark, had started moving differently. His patterns had changed. His confidence had vanished. He knew what was coming, and he was running. Jade had spent the last 2 days tracking him, watching from a distance, piecing together the way fear had changed him. He wasn't like Briggs. There was no arrogance left in him, no laughter, no jokes about how untouchable he was. There was only the look of a man who had realized, too late, that he was prey, but he was still dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose. Always was. Jade pulled in a slow breath, adjusting the strap of the backpack slung over her shoulder. The weight of it familiar, grounding. She had everything she needed. She had planned for this. And yet, the conflict still settled in the spaces between her ribs, tightening, pressing. She had killed before, in war, in battle, in moments where hesitation meant death. But this wasn't a battlefield, and Tate wasn't holding a weapon. Not yet. She stopped at the end of the block, her eyes scanning the quiet street. the dim glow of a motel sign flickering against the cracked pavement. Tate was inside. She had followed him here hours ago, had watched him move with the erratic paranoia of a man who knew he was next, had seen the way he checked the exits, the way he never let his back turn to the door. She should go inside. She should finish it. But for the first time since this had begun, she hesitated. Was she still the soldier hunting down an enemy? Or was she something else now? A slow exhale, steady, measured. Raven was dead, and this man had helped kill her. That was all that mattered. Her hands flexed at her sides, her jaw tightening as she took the first step forward. Doubt or not, this was the path she had chosen, and there was no turning back now. Jade exhaled slowly, her breath controlled, her pulse steady, her body weight shifting slightly as she reached for the motel door. The cold metal of the handle pressed against her palm, the slight give of the lock a reminder of how easily she had slipped past security. The motel was cheap, its defenses non-existent, just like the man inside who had spent years hiding behind a badge, mistaking it for armor. She eased the door open, moving without sound, stepping into the stale, dimly lit room. The single lamp cast weak light over the threadbare carpet, the uneven flicker of a motel sign outside bleeding through the cheap curtains. The room smelled of sweat, old cigarettes, and fear. Tate sat hunched on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together, his head low. He hadn't moved much since she started tracking him, his nerves unraveling a little more each day, his paranoia eating away at whatever composure he once had. But he still had his gun. It rested just inches away on the nightstand, close enough for him to reach. Jade let the door click shut behind her. Tate's head snapped up, his eyes wide, his breath catching, his hand already moving for the weapon. But she was faster. Her boot crashed against the nightstand, sending the gun skidding across the floor. Tate lunged, but she was already moving. She caught his wrist mid-motion, twisting hard, sending him sprawling backward onto the bed. He grunted, coughing as he tried to right himself. But she stepped into his space, pinning him down with her presence alone. His chest rose and fell quickly, his breath uneven, his mind still catching up to the reality of what was happening. Jade stared down at him, her expression unreadable. "You've been running," she said, her voice calm, measured. "Did you really think you could outrun this?" Tate's fingers curled against the sheets, his body tense, his pulse hammering at his throat. "You don't have to do this," he breathed, his voice hoarse, desperate. Jade tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp, unwavering. "That's where you're wrong." Tate swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the door, toward the floor, toward anywhere but her face. "Briggs is dead," she continued, stepping closer. "Cole is dead. And now, it's just you." Tate's breath hitched. She could see the way his fingers twitched, his shoulders tensed, the way his mind raced to find a way out. "I didn't kill her," he muttered, his voice weak, unconvincing. I didn't mean to." Jade inhaled slowly, her jaw tightening. "You fired your weapon," she said, her tone quiet, even. Tate's lips parted slightly, but no words came. "You shot at us," she continued, stepping forward, watching as his body locked in place. "And you weren't just following orders, were you?" Tate swallowed again, his breath uneven. "You weren't some scared rookie caught in the crossfire. You weren't just standing by while Briggs called the shots," Jade murmured, her voice sharper now, pressing into the silence like a blade. "You took your own shots. You made your own decisions. And you put a bullet in my sister." Tate flinched, his fingers curling tighter against the sheets. Jade leaned down slightly, closing the space between them. "I looked into you," she whispered, his breath hitched. "I know what you've done." Tate's face paled, his pulse hammering visibly at his throat. Jade tilted her head slightly, watching him. "You think Raven was the first?" He shook his head quickly, his lips pressing together, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. I didn't." "You've done this before," Jade cut in, her voice sharp, unwavering, not just to her, others. Tate exhaled sharply, his eyes darting away, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow bursts. "You've harassed, brutalized, and terrorized people who look like my sister," Jade continued, her voice quieter now, but no less lethal. "You just never killed anyone before her. That was the line, wasn't it? The one thing that kept you convinced you were still a good man, still just a cop doing his job." His breath hitched. "But you crossed that line," she whispered. "You took that shot, and you can't take it back." Tate swallowed hard, his body locked in place, his breath uneven. Jade straightened slowly, inhaling deeply, steadying herself. "Briggs gave the order, but you pulled the trigger, and you knew exactly what you were doing." Silence. Jade watched as the last of his denial crumbled, as the weight of his own guilt finally settled into his bones. His shoulders sagged slightly, his lips parting as if to speak, but nothing came. Jade exhaled slowly, stepping back. "You think if you beg, if you make excuses, I'll let you walk out of here?" She shook her head slightly, her gaze unreadable. "But I'm not Briggs, and I don't let monsters run free." Tate's breath stuttered, his entire body trembling now, his fingers twitching slightly as if trying to grasp onto something that wasn't there. Jade took one last slow step forward, her presence pressing down on him, suffocating, inevitable. "You took the most important thing in my life," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "And now I'm going to make sure you never take anything from anyone ever again." Tate's breath hitched violently, his muscles locking. He could see it now, the end. Jade's body shifted, her weight settling into something looser, something prepared. Tate saw it, and for the first time since this began, he fought. He surged forward, his body twisting, his hand reaching for anything, an escape, an opening, a way to survive. But Jade had been waiting for this. The fight had begun. Tate moved fast, but Jade was faster. The second his body surged forward, she had already anticipated the motion, already read the shift in his muscles, the way his breath hitched just before the lunge. He reached for her, desperate, wild, a man grasping at his last chance to survive. But she sidestepped effortlessly, her foot sweeping out in a sharp arc, catching his ankle and sending him crashing onto the stained motel carpet. He hit the floor hard, his breath leaving him in a sharp grunt, but he scrambled to his feet quickly, his pulse hammering, his chest rising and falling in ragged, erratic bursts, his hands curled into fists, his posture shifting, his entire body coiling like a trapped animal that had finally realized there was no escape. "You think you're going to get away with this?" he snarled, his voice hoarse, unsteady, the words spitting from his lips as he tried to force some control back into the situation. "You think no one's going to come after you?" Jade remained still, her body loose, her breathing even. "You've killed 2 cops, Tate continued, trying to straighten, trying to regain his footing, trying to believe he still had a way out of this. "They're going to find out. They're going to come for you. They'll bury you under a prison for the rest of your life." Jade tilted her head slightly, watching him, waiting for the words to settle, waiting for him to hear them himself, waiting for him to realize the flaw in his own threat. "But they haven't," she murmured, her voice quiet, calm, sharp as steel. Tate hesitated. Jade took a slow step forward, closing the space between them, watching the way his throat bobbed, the way his fingers twitched just slightly, the way his body tensed with something that wasn't just fear, but realization. "Why hasn't anyone come for me, Tate?" she asked, her tone almost gentle now, almost curious, almost mocking. "Why hasn't the department put out a warrant? Why haven't they kicked down my door?" Tate's breath caught, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came. Jade exhaled slowly, the corners of her lips barely tilting in something that wasn't quite a smirk, wasn't quite amusement, just understanding. "You didn't tell them," she said simply. Tate swallowed hard, his face pale, his body frozen in place. "You didn't report me," she continued, her voice quieter now, pressing into the silence, filling every inch of space between them. "Because if you did, They'd start looking at why I was coming after you. They'd start asking questions. They'd start digging. Tate exhaled shakily, his pulse thrumming violently at his throat. They'd find out about Raven, Jade murmured, taking another slow step closer. They'd find out about the others. Tate flinched. And then, she whispered, they wouldn't just be coming for me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jade could see the moment it all fully sank in, the way the weight of it crashed over him, the way the fight left his muscles in slow, crumbling waves. His hands unclenched, his shoulders sagging slightly, his breath still sharp, but not out of anger, not out of defiance, just inevitability. She had won, and he knew it. Jade inhaled slowly, tilting her head, studying him, waiting for the plea, for the regret, for the last, final, desperate attempt to bargain for his life. But it never came. Tate let out a slow, uneven breath, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to say something, but then he closed them again, his eyes darting away, his body locking up. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to ask for mercy, because he knew he didn't deserve it. Jade nodded slightly, more to herself than to him. Good, she murmured. Then she moved, quick, precise, painless. Tate's body jerked once, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes going wide for a single, fleeting moment before the light in them faded. And then silence. Jade exhaled slowly, standing over him, her pulse steady, her breath even. It was done. 3 men, 3 gone, and Raven's name would never be forgotten. She turned toward the door, her movements smooth, her body loose, her mind already shifting to what came next. There was nothing left for her here. She had done what she came to do. Now it was time to disappear. The city stretched out before her, restless and unknowing, its streets still moving, its people still breathing, oblivious to what had been done in the dark, to the war that had been fought and won in the spaces between streetlights, the neon glow reflected in the rain-slicked pavement, the hum of engines and distant voices blending into the night like a pulse, steady, unbothered, untouched. Jade stood just beyond it all, her breath slow, measured, her body loose despite the weight pressing into her chest, the slow, steady thrum of what came next, settling into her bones. The motel was behind her now, its doors shut, its rooms still, the world inside of it already fading into the past. Tate was gone, Briggs was gone, Cole was gone. 3 men who had walked through life certain they were untouchable, certain their actions would never catch up to them, certain that no one would ever hold them accountable. They had been wrong. But now, as she stood at the edge of the city, at the threshold of what came after, she found herself wondering if it had been enough. Raven was still dead, and nothing she had done would change that. She had hunted them down, had made them answer for what they had done, had ensured that none of them would ever have the chance to hurt another person the way they had hurt her sister. But the world hadn't changed. The streets still moved. The city still breathed. The corruption still settled in its foundations, in its institutions, in its people. She had burned out a disease, but she had not burned out the system that allowed it to exist, and maybe she never would. Jade exhaled slowly, the thought settling deep, pressing against something she wasn't sure she could name. Was this justice? Or was it just vengeance? She had spent her entire life following orders, fighting wars that weren't her own, taking lives because she had been trained to do so, because she had been told it was necessary, that the enemy had to be neutralized, that the mission had to be completed. But this time, there had been no orders, there had been no command, no mission, just her rage, her grief, her choice. And now, as she stood on the other side of it, she wasn't sure what that meant. She closed her eyes for just a moment, inhaling deeply, letting the cold air fill her lungs, letting the night settle into her skin. The weight of what she had done would never leave her. She had known that before she started, had accepted it before she had taken her first step down this path. And yet, as she opened her eyes again, as she looked out over the city that had stolen everything from her, that had let men like Briggs and Tate and Cole exist unchecked for years, she knew one thing for certain. She had done what needed to be done. The cemetery was quiet, untouched by the restless hum of the city beyond its gates. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint perfume of wilting flowers, the weight of memory settling over the rows of headstones like an unspoken truth. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed grass, the sky bleeding from orange to deep indigo, the last light of the day slipping beneath the horizon. Jade stood before the grave, her breath slow, steady, her hands tucked loosely into the pockets of her jacket. The name carved into the headstone was crisp, unweathered, still too new, still too raw. Raven Bennett. The letters stood cold and final, unmoving, untouched by time. It had been months since that night, since she had walked away from the city, since she had closed the door on the men who had taken her sister's life. She had spent those months in the quiet spaces of the world, moving from town to town, never staying long, never settling, never letting herself believe that there was something waiting for her beyond what she had already done. She had avenged Raven. She had made them pay. But what did that make her? She exhaled slowly, kneeling down, pressing her palm flat against the cold marble, the familiar weight of grief settling into her chest. "They're gone," she murmured, her voice low, quiet, meant only for the one person who could no longer hear it. "They won't hurt anyone else." The words should have felt like closure, should have settled something inside her, but they didn't, not really, because justice had never been part of this. The system had never righted itself, had never held the guilty accountable. That had been her hands, her choice, and that was what lingered. She let her fingers trace the engraved letters, the cool stone beneath her skin grounding her, reminding her of the girl who had once believed in fairness, in fighting battles with words, with evidence, with the truth. Raven had always been that person. She had believed in the world, in change, in the idea that corruption could be fought with persistence and courage, and it had killed her. Jade closed her eyes, the memory sharp, pressing against her ribs, coiling in the space where the rage had once lived, where the grief still did. She had spent her life fighting in wars that weren't hers, had spent years learning how to take a life without hesitating, without questioning, without letting it haunt her. But this had been different. She had made sure of that. She wasn't haunted by what she had done, but she wasn't sure she could call herself the good guy either. A slow breath. The truth was simple. She hadn't done this because it was right. She had done it because it had to be done. And if that made her something else, something darker, something more dangerous, so be it. Her fingers curled slightly, pressing against the headstone, the finality of it settling deeper into her bones. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be after this." She swallowed, her throat tight, her pulse steady. "But I'm still here, and I made sure they're not." That, at least, she could live with. The wind shifted, rustling through the trees, a slow, steady whisper against the silence. She sat there for a long time, letting the weight of it all settle, letting the world move around her, letting the past and the present and everything in between bleed together in the spaces where grief and vengeance had carved something permanent inside her. Then, finally, she stood. Her fingers traced the stone one last time, a quiet farewell, a silent promise. Then she turned, stepping back into the world, into the unknown, into whatever came next. She didn't know if she was the good guy, but she knew Raven had been, and that was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.